before we get started. But like I said, try to make this as interactive as possible. So there is a chat section. If you do have any questions, we will take some questions at the end. But if there's anything pressing or any questions you have, please do use the chat facility. As you know, tonight's course is a CE accredited. You will receive 1 CE credit for attending tonight's webinar. You should receive that in 7 to 10 business days after the webinar via email. Okay, so again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to join me. My name's Lee Tessler. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group. I've been here for over 3 years now. And tonight we're just going to talk about some of the important factors of your lease. If you do lease your building, or even if you own your building, we're going to touch on quite a few different points. It's really beneficial. So let's get started. So first of all, I want to just talk about these 3 numbers, 85, 54, and 80. Now, I like to mention these numbers at the beginning of my presentation because they're very relevant. Now, 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. And 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And 80% of landlords structure their lease to give them at least 50% of the proceeds when a practice is sold. I mean, these are quite astonishing numbers when we look at it statistically like this. We will dig into a little bit deeper in terms of the lease, but I just wanted to bring that out at the outset. So I think it's important for you to understand a little bit more about Cirrus Consulting Group and who we are and how we've been representing the dental community now for over 25 years. And we are essentially a healthcare and dental specialist tenant representation firm. Like I said, we were actually founded in Alberta 25 years ago by dentists for dentists, really for the reason that the dental tenant was being taken advantage of by the landlord. As a dental tenant, you know it's an expensive business to enter into, and it can be also a very profitable business to exit out of as well. Since our inception, we've negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical office leases. Majority of our clients, I would say 75%, is dentists, but we do look after other healthcare professionals, general practitioners, veterinarians, rheumatologists, any medical professionals. We've had some experience in representing denturists. And what makes us unique is we do everything in-house. So we have an in-house legal and leasing team, all with a background in healthcare, some former real estate brokers, and some lawyers on staff. Annually, we represent over 500 doctors throughout North America. And as you know, tonight's course is CE accredited, so we do deliver over 100 continuing education accredited seminars or webinars this year, or last year, majority of webinars. And we do lecture at most of the major dental conventions, Greater New York, the Pacific Dental Conference, which I think I was at around this time, beginning of March last year. That's the last travel that I've made since we went into a lockdown, and since then we've been getting used to Zooms and webinars. So we really do represent dentists nationwide. Now, I wanted to just show you this screen, and you may recognize some. You may recognize some colleagues here or some people. So we really have worked with a number of dentists right across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and as you can see, I mean, as you'll see as we go along, and some of the Google reviews, some of the letters of reference and testimonials, we really do represent a niche market of tenants over the whole of Western Canada. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor in terms of the market and in terms of what we're seeing. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of uncertainty during 2020 and COVID. Many people have taken some of the approach to not do anything, and in some cases they may have taken short-term renewals just to allow some more time to determine the kind of footprint post-COVID. We are seeing a little bit of a shift from office space towards retail opportunities. Lots of offices now with people working from home has given some of the landlords and tenants decisions to make, whether to continue to perform how much office space that they may need. And hence with COVID and the retail sector being affected quite a lot, there's opportunities have arisen with lots of vacancies, and the medical practitioner, and I'm not saying that the office space has become redundant, because it's still very much in play, but lots of people are now seeing some opportunities to open up, or maybe move out of a medical building into a retail strip plaza, and they want to have a bit more exposure. But vacancies are still going down, and there is definitely an opportunity. Landlords, they're not keen to lower rents, but they are certainly keen to offer new incentives with new long-term renewals, whether that's via sort of free rent or some tenant improvement allowance. There's definitely deals and opportunities and deals to be done. So the purpose of today's webinar is really just to dig into the importance of the office lease agreement. And we're going to look at some of the key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement. And we're going to go through some practical advice on negotiating the lease agreement. So I wanted to just produce this slide because I know that there's people that own their own building, and we have a conversation quite regularly on people whether they should continue to lease or they should buy their own space. So just wanted to talk about some of the sort of pros and cons of buying versus leasing. Now, when it comes to buying, clearly that's going to require a large upfront investment. Gives you the opportunity on the pros to have freedom of control. You don't have to ask permission to make any changes. You are your own boss, but then you do become a landlord. You are then responsible. If you have other tenants within your building, it's your job to have to facilitate if there are any problems. If something's wrong with the plumbing, or something happens with the washroom, you know, the tenant is gonna ring you, and it's your job to manage that responsibility. So if you are owning your own building, you have to really take into consideration that it's a second job, becoming a landlord. You obviously have greater flexibility on how you use the space. You don't have to ask permission. If you want to make changes, if you want to do some structural changes, you can do that. And in terms of leasing, now, clearly this requires only a small upfront payment, as you're not buying the building. So you do have some greater working capital towards the practice in terms of refurbishment, remodeling, and if you want to invest in the actual clinic, upgrade some of the operatories, some new equipment, then cash flow, you can do that. And also, one of the other things is you do have the flexibility to relocate or expand. One of the things with owning your own building, one of the negatives is, you're there for the long term, the duration. If something happens in the demographic of the area, becomes a little bit, changes its demographic, and maybe it's not the most desirable place, and people are moving out, maybe some low income families, then you can't just relocate. You own the building. But the main point I want to get across is whether you lease a space or own a building, the key common denominator is the dental office lease. And one of the things that I want to stress, and sometimes this does get missed, whether you lease your building or own the building, it's still very important to have a lease, especially if you own the building, to have an arm's length lease that separates the building from the practice. You may come to a time in the future where you decide to sell your practice, but you want to keep the real estate. Now, and we will see as we go along a little bit later, part of the valuation is in the lease. And that needs to be some documentation for tax reasons. And again, your accountant will probably go into a little bit more detail. But if you do own the building, it's very important to have a lease that separates the two entities, the building and the practice, because you may sell both. You may want to sell the building, keep the dental practice, or you may vice versa want to just keep the building and sell the dental practice. So it's extremely important to have that lease in place. Now, a question that I always ask at all my seminars, and I'm normally in front of people and live, is what is a lease? What actually is a lease? Now, here, normally I would obviously get a little bit more feedback. Some people would say, it's a contractual agreement between the landlord and the tenant. So I would argue it's actually a check. And it's one of the biggest checks that you will write in your business working life. Now, if you just take an average square foot space of, say, $2,000 square foot, and let's say if you're paying $5,000 rent, just the base rent per month, you're looking at around $60,000 per annum. Now, the average dentist, statistically, stays at their space for 22 years. Now, if you take that into consideration, and again, I'm just talking about purely the base rent. The $60,000 per annum over 10 years is $600,000. 20 years, 1.2 million, and that's not including any rent escalations, just been going up each year with inflation. We're not talking about common area maintenance, any of your additional operating expenses. So you're writing a check when you sign a lease somewhere in the region of $1.5 million. And the majority of dentists and medical professionals we speak to, they look at the term, they look at what they're paying, and normally they'll put the lease, the 40, 50-page document in their drawer and probably won't look at it again for 5 or 10 years when the renewal comes up. Now, the purpose of tonight's webinar is really to look into some of the other legal provisions, some of the other liabilities within the lease, not just the financials, the monthly, the rent, but some of the actual liabilities and areas of concern that we see and we have seen and continue to see, which could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if not addressed and not structured correctly. So why is the office lease so important? Now, if you drove up to your space tomorrow morning, you stopped off for your Tim Horton coffee or Starbucks or whatever your preferred choice of beverage, and drove up and then came to your office, to your practice, and then there was a sign on the door giving you 30 days notice, an eviction notice giving you 30 days to be out of your space. And what would you do? Because unlike an office of lawyers or accountants, very unlikely, virtually impossible, that you are going to be able to do anything in that period of time to continue practicing. Because to relocate a dental office can take months and months. You can't just move over the weekend. Your office location is the foundation of your practice. You may have been in this community, you may have served a community of families, and you look after their children and grandchildren, and people know your dental practice because of the location of where you're at. As I said, investment, cost to build. Now, we work very closely with Henry Schein, and we look after and support a lot of their clients. They're actually sponsoring tonight's event, which we're very grateful for. And if any of you have relationships, not just with Henry Schein or any of the other dental supply equipment, you'll know that you're looking at around $150 to $200 per square foot to build out a new practice. Now, again, anywhere in the region of $300,000-$400,000 to build out a new practice, and that doesn't even include equipment. There's so many variables in setting up a dental practice, and if any of you have had to build out a practice before or had to relocate, I'm sure you can speak for that experience. That it's not, it's very doable and it can be very rewarding, but it's not an easy process, and it's expensive and time consuming to move. And also the lease has a real bearing on the practice sale. When it comes to selling the practice, any bank, anyone that's looking to buy the practice, they're going to need term on a lease to amortize the loan that they're most likely going to get to finance the purchase. Now, most banks require at least 5 years of term remaining. Some will require 10 years term remaining, whether that's in term and options. It's extremely important not to make the mistake and think, well, you know, I'm coming up to retirement, or I'm looking to sell my practice and I've got a few years left on my lease, and I'll just, when that comes up, then, you know, I don't want to extend it for any longer. I don't want to commit for any longer, and I'll just sell it when the lease expires. Now, that is a mistake, because if you're on a month to month, or if your lease is running out of term, you lose control of your asset. And the landlord could very easily say, well, sorry, I've got someone else who wants to come in. And when you lose a massive valuation part of your practice, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. And also, like I said, it's your asset. You've spent thousands of dollars each month, hundreds of thousands of dollars over years. Now, you want to have some control of the asset, and the lease, a good, well-structured dental office lease, gives you leverage, adds value to the actual lease when it comes to selling. Because I can tell you that not only do we deal with a lot of tenants that are looking to renew a lease, or we do with a lot of people that are looking to acquire a practice, and many occasions we will get a lease that a buyer has asked us to look over, who's acquiring to buy someone's practice, and we'll review a lease, and then there's huge number of liabilities on the lease, which we make them aware. Then most likely they're going to just knock that off the asking price that you're asking for. So we didn't want to leave any money on the table. So as I was saying just a little bit before, what are the 3 key sellable components of your practice? Now, there are specific practice transition reps at Henry Schein that can certainly look into this in a bit more detail. One of them is your equipment. Now, what tends to happen is they'll value your equipment. Now, in some cases, people will continue to upgrade equipment with making it more digital, but the equipment does have a big part in the valuation of the practice. Also, goodwill, patient chart, but again, what does that mean? The term goodwill is sometimes used loosely. Again, like I said earlier, in terms of your reputation, if you've been at a space, if you've been at a practice for a location for a long time, you've built up a good reputation, and you have thousands of active patients, and we normally look at the last sort of 3 years of collections and patients. So it's important, even when you're coming up to retirement, lots of people start to slow down, maybe take a few days a week to improve their golf handicap, or just enjoy a bit more time, and the revenue starts to filter off towards the last few years, and that can affect the valuation of the practice. So you really need to think about how that transition, how that looks like. You want to just have a clean exit where you work, and then you sell the practice at the sort of pinnacle, at the height, or if you slow down, do you need to bring in an associate to keep the revenue? So you have to just bear that in mind, because sometimes it comes to a point towards the end where people start to slow down, and that can affect the valuation. But again, the main thing is that take into consideration when selling a practice, when evaluating a practice, is the lease. If you have good equipment and you have a nice patient, you have good patients, good active patients. If you don't have a long-term lease, or if you don't have a lease that allows you to remain in the building, then what's that practice worth? Someone can't come into that same location where you've been successful. Yeah, you may be able to sell some equipment, you may be able to sell your charts, but without a well-structured lease, what impact can that have on the sale? 100% impact it can have on the sale. So what should the office lease do for you? So this is a question that I get asked a lot. If you had a magic wand and you could decide what your lease is going to do for you, what you'd want to be in the lease, what would that be? So firstly, you want it to provide fair and affordable financial terms. So what do I mean by that? So you want to make sure that you're paying fair market value when it comes to rent, equivalent to the demographic that you're actually in. If you're in downtown Winnipeg, or if you're in Regina, or wherever you are, you want to make sure relative to the space, if it's a retail space, if it's an office space, you want to make sure that you're paying rent, fair market rent. Now, a dental tenant will pay a premium, so you may see lots of vacancies, and you may see dollar per square foot being offered less than you're paying. But again, you have to take into consideration the overall package in terms of a dental tenant, especially new vacancies or landlords trying to entice new clients. Then yeah, there are some incentives that are being offered. You also want the lease to provide some sort of long-term stability and security. So again, what do I mean by that? You want to make sure that you have the option to, if an adjacent space became available next door, and you were at capacity and you thought, I actually could expand into the space next door, you want to have a right of first refusal. You don't want to be in a situation where there's a vacant space next door and before you know it, someone else has leased the space and you don't even have a say in that. When we renegotiate and when we get involved in renewing leases, we normally recommend a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. Now, that doesn't mean that you're stuck solely for 10 years. If structured correctly, you can still sell the practice within that time. But if you are investing in a new space, or if you are making any changes and remodeling, or if you've put a lot of money into it, again, you want to make sure that you have long-term security in the space, that you can't be kicked out at the drop of a hat. Also, we want to minimize your risk and exposure. Now, many of you that would have signed a lease maybe way back when you came out of dental school, and you would have had to provide a personal guarantee. Now, this is quite common. The majority of you would have had to provide a personal guarantee. You may have had to sign the lease personally. It may actually just be in your own name, not in your corporation. So what we want to do in this situation, you want to minimize the risk and exposure. Now, like I said, when you first started your practice, you would have had to sign a personal guarantee. And you would be amazed on how many people that I speak to who have been at the same building for 20, 25 years and signed a personal guarantee, and they've paid their rent, been a really great tenant, and they're now, at a different stage of their career where they don't have as much debt and they have much more assets and capital in their own wealth. Whereas when you're starting out and you're offering a personal guarantee, your likely is that you've got carrying a lot of debt anyway. And what amazes me is that after 25 years, the doctor is still providing a personal guarantee. Now, in some cases, best case scenario, you want to remove that personal liability. But in other cases, you want to limit the liability. So after a period of time where you provided a personal guarantee and you provided a personal guarantee, and you want to, after a period of time, and you've proved that you're a good tenant and you're able to pay the rent, then at some stage you should be able to have that removed. We want to maximize your flexibility. Like a bit of that I talked about before, whether it's even if you're thinking about, and there's an opportunity to maybe buy the building that you've been in a long time, you want to have the right of first refusal to maybe purchase if it's a strata unit, a condo, an office building, you want to have the opportunity to maybe buy that building. So you want to have first right of refusal, like I said, with whether it was to lease the adjacent space or buy the building. And then also you want to enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. So we will get into some of the technical aspects of the lease in a little bit. But really the key eventuality is when you come to sell your practice, you are pretty much in the hands of the landlord. He is going to be the one to say yes or no. You can transfer the lease. You can assign the lease to somebody else. And they can make it extremely difficult for you to sell the practice. Because in their eyes, You've been in our location, you've been in our building for a long, long time. We've helped your success, and they know that a large transaction is going to take place when it comes to actually, an acquisition of a practice. And if they don't agree to assign the lease, then what are you going to do? So what is in your lease? Now, there are a number of provisions in the lease. And like I said a bit earlier, tonight, if you can walk away, I mean, you're not going to walk away as experts, but if you can have an understanding and walk away tonight, or leave the webinar tonight, just really understanding and appreciating that the value that you bring as a tenant, and also some of the pitfalls that we see, not in the financials, but in the actual legal provisions of the lease. Now, I want to talk about a couple of provisions tonight, just to give some examples. So this is the option to renew, a provision, option to renew language, which is found in 90% of leases. So just going to give you a quick minute just to read over that. Now, again, I don't expect you to be experts, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things in this option to renew language. Now, the first thing that you can see is it says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as a tenant. Now, if you can see that the tenant, the T is capitalized, meaning that if your landlord has given you 2 5-year options, he has given and provided those options to you, and only you as the tenant. Now, I was working with a doctor in Winnipeg, and he was coming up for retirement, and he told me that he had 12 years remaining on his lease. He wasn't concerned, and there was enough term to sell the practice, and he wasn't concerned. After I actually took a look at his lease, what actually transpired was that he had about 18 months, just under 2 years left of term remaining, and 2 5-year options. But like I said, those 2 5-year options were personal to this doctor. They were non-transferable. And what that means is you go to sell the practice, and the landlord will say, well, hang on, Mr. Black, hang on, Dr. Black, I gave those 2 5 options to you. I didn't give them to the next potential buyer. Now, savvy landlords will do this because they know that there's an opportunity to renegotiate the terms of the lease with the new buyer. In some cases, make it more difficult to sell the practice or increase rents. And as you can see, there is a number of other red flags just in this one provision in terms of what the rent will be going forward in the future. And the other thing I wanted to point out was any such renewal can then be on the landlord's current standard form lease. Now, I can tell you, we worked with a doctor we negotiated a lease for a doctor probably about 10 years ago, and we got some fantastic wins. We were able to remove some of the personal liability. We were include a death and disability provision. We got a number of great wins. And when the tenant decided to exercise his option and didn't actually tell us that what he was doing, he just exercised the option. The landlord then put the tenant back onto a standard form lease. He actually, not only did he put him on a standard form lease, he was able to include a demolition provision in the option. So not only had he all the good work that we had, all the good wins and work that we've got for him in the original lease negotiation, the landlord was then able to put him back on a standard form lease and add a demolition provision into the lease. And all he did was, and all he thought he was doing was just exercising his option. But the language in this option to renew language enabled the landlord to make some changes back to the current standard form lease. The other section, which is extremely important, is the assignment and subletting section. Again, this is found in 75% of dental leases. This provision really just enables you to transfer the lease, normally in conjunction with a acquisition, a purchase or a sale of the practice. Again, I'm going to just give you a minute just to have a quick read over this provision, and then we'll go through some of the points and some of the red flags that we see on a daily basis. So the landlord, the first thing it has to receive is consent. The tenant has to receive consent of the landlord. Now this is standard. The landlord is, you're not just going to be able to transfer the lease without asking for permission. The landlord's not just going to let anybody take over the space that he has no idea about. Now, normally you have a certain time period whereby, you have to provide the landlord with information on the new buyer, whether they're financially credible. And the landlord, in this case, has three choices. One, just to approve the tenant's request. Two, he can just decline the tenant's request. And three, he can terminate the lease agreement upon an effective date, just for you asking permission to assign the lease. Now, this is what we call a termination clause. Again, found in 75% of dental office leases. Just asking for permission to assign the lease, the landlord can terminate the lease. If we look a little bit further, it says the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term or greater the current market rent of the lease premises to 15% greater than the current rent. So the landlord could say, okay, no problem, Dr. Black. I'm happy to approve the assignment, but the rents are going to be increased by 15%. Now, if you've agreed if you've agreed a sale price with the buyer, and then he finds out rents are going to go up 15% from what you're paying, I know if I'm that buyer, I'm going to reduce my asking price. I'm going to reduce my offer by 15% right there and then. And furthermore, if the tenant is to receive any rental income, cash goods, any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of the lease above the current base rental rates. So, for example, if you were paying $60,000 per annum and you sold your practice for $500,000, from this language, the landlord is entitled to $440,000 for the sale, for your sale of the practice. So all your blood, sweat, and tears, and the landlord says, "Thank you very much. He knows there's a large financial transaction taking place. Now, in some cases, like I said, this is what's known as proceeds of sale. In some cases, we've seen 50% of proceeds of sale. And if any of you are thinking, well, this is not going to happen and I'm not paying my landlord anything, right? I can tell you, and I've seen it in my own eyes, where a doctor was selling his practice and the practice was worth a lot more, well over $1 million. And it came down to the sort of 25th hour, and the landlord, dotted the I's, crossed the T's, agreed, and was, desperate to get out. And this is a practice sale that was way over $1 million. And in the end, had to pay the landlord $120,000 to get out of, for the landlord to approve the sale. And in this doctor's case, he had to take the hit because he wanted to sell the practice, and he was still, in his eyes, making over $1 million. But he had to still pay the landlord $120,000. Now, we don't want to leave any money on the table. And then the final thing, notwithstanding any consent, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease, shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So you sell your practice to a young associate, he takes on a little bit too much debt, buys a new house, new car. If he defaults on the loan 2-3 years later, the landlord can still come after you. You could be retired, enjoying your retirement on the beach or wherever you choose to spend your retirement, and you can get a call. The last thing you want to do is get a call from the landlord 3-4 years later to say, sorry, you need to come back and start practicing because you're the buyer that took over the lease has defaulted on the loan. So again, this is just one provision found in 75% of dental office leases. And just within that provision, there's at least 5 or 6 red flags that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if not structured, if not written correctly. Now, as I said, there are a number of other provisions within a lease that can be very damaging. I'm not going to go through all of those tonight because we will be here for a long time. Some of you may have a relocation provision. Some of you may have a demolition clause in your lease. A death and disability. This is something that we feel very strongly we try to insert into any leases that we negotiate. This just gives you and your estate, your heirs, successors, the opportunity to terminate the lease. God forbid something was to happen to you where you were unable to practice wet finger dentistry, whether it was through, you became incapacitated or worst case scenario, you passed away. This just enables your estate to terminate the lease regardless of the number of years remaining. Now, this is a slide that we actually got from one of our lease negotiators who used to work on the landlord side, and this is a tenant lease cycle. Now, I really like this slide because when we advise any client that they should, first of all, should know any key critical dates when the lease expires, exactly the date, if there's an option to exercise that option, how much notice do they have to give, 6 months, 12 months, because any option that you have to exercise, if you miss that deadline, that options and any further options become null and void. Now, why do we recommend starting the process at least 24 months before expiry? One, because of what we talked about, gives you a lot of leverage in case something goes wrong, something that we're not happy with during the negotiations. At least it gives you the opportunity. You may not want to move. You may never want to move. You may be very happy. But the closer we get to this section, the 12 to 8 months to this red bar here. And let me tell you, the landlord is not going to be in any rush to tell you, you know, Mr. Doctor, you've got an option coming up or an expiry. They'll be more than happy to delay, because they know that when they get into the sort of 8 months and less, they know realistically the chances of you going anywhere or moving becomes extremely slim. As we talked about, it takes a long time and it's very expensive to move. So we want to start the process at least 2 years before expiry. And negotiations, they can take months back and forth. There's hours of legal negotiations, but the key here is start the process. The earlier you start, the better leverage that you have. Now, during COVID, what we've seen in the last year is really an unprecedented opportunity. The opportunity whereby certain landlords are struggling. There's lots of vacancies, and it's a great opportunity to reset some financials with long-term lease renewals. Now, if you're looking to expand or set satellite office or even relocate, you may not be happy with where you are. Financing is at some of the lowest rates of our lifetime. And like I said, I know Henry Schein in terms of equipment. Everybody's looking to do deals. So it's a great time. In any downtime, in any market where we see a downtime, you'll have entrepreneurs, you'll have people that will take advantage. You'll have some people that will, you know, just do nothing and wait for the market to recover, depending on their risk appetite for risk. But we are certainly seeing an unprecedented opportunity. Now, how have we been successful? What are some of the tactics that we use for winning, you know, lease negotiations? So the first thing that we do is we gather all the documentation. So if you have an existing lease and you have 3 or 4 renewals, lease amending agreements, so we gather all the documentation, all the fully executed documentation to make sure we have all the information. We would then set up a call whereby we would go through your current situation, look at some of your career goals, where you want to be in the future, so that we can align the lease with your career goals. We then review the office lease for any risks, any liabilities, any concerns, like I said, with all the assignment language and option to renew language and any other provisions. We pay for a lot of market research whereby we're able to see the current rental rates, some of the vacancies, the reports. So we do a lot of research before, and then we develop a strategy. And these 5 steps we do, and we haven't at this stage, we haven't even reached out, we haven't even spoken to the landlord. So we do a lot of due diligence, a lot of process before. So when we go in, we know what type of landlord we're dealing with. Is it a big REIT institutional landlord? Is it a mum and pop? What the area is? What's the demographic? What's the vacancies? We go in really armed with the knowledge. And then you're looking at 15, 20 hours of lease negotiations of the financials. And when I say financials, it's not just the rent, it's the base rent, the rent escalations, the common area maintenance, additional expenses, if there's any landlord work, any tenant improvement allowance. There's 7 or 8 different variables. And then we also negotiate some of the lease terms. So like I talked about with the assignment provision and all the other provisions that we try to educate the landlord that, you know, the dental tenant for them to run their business successfully, and they're happy to commit to a longer term lease. So there's certain things within the lease that for them to run their business successfully that need to be addressed. And then we're with you till you have a final executed lease review, executed lease. And again, we've been doing this for 25 years, and just a couple of, we've got over 100 5-star Google reviews. I asked my marketing team just to pull up a couple of examples of why, we're a very niche business and why we've been very successful. And lots of people say, well, my landlord, he doesn't negotiate and he's not going to change anything. Well, I can tell you like how many times we've heard that and how many times we've actually improved the relationship, not just with the landlord, because we realize that, you have to work with these people for a long period of time. So we're not looking to go in guns blazing and, cause a problem. But, any professional landlord will most likely have their own lawyer, representative, and it's quite common, and we're very well known across Western Canada, and we've worked with lots of people before. But you can see here, this doctor is 74 years of age and was forced to relocate his practice, and we were able to help the relocation and get the new landlord to cover 100% of the build-out costs. It just is some of the examples, some of the success stories that we've had. And this is a case study on a doctor that worked in Winnipeg on New Start, whereby we were able to make over 5,900% return on investment. We negotiated 6 months free rent, a tenant improvement allowance. We had good exclusivity for the dentist, the assignment language. There was release from any liability. He was able to bring in associates. We had the death and disability protection added. So you can see that over the long period of time, the return on investment is second to none. Now, one of the services that we provide is what's called a critical date risk analysis. Now, this has a dollar value of $1,995. And in this, what we do is we spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for traps. We go through the 40, 50 pages of the lease document that you may not have read, that we were talking about earlier. We would look for any liabilities and areas of concern. We'd do a very deep dive into, like I said, some of the demographic and the current rental rates. We would then schedule a call, go through your vision, and we would then review, obviously, some of the traps and some of the liabilities and areas of concerns in our findings. And then we will come up with a sort of treatment plan strategy on how to negotiate effectively a tactical plan. And thanks to our sponsors at Henry Schein, that $1,995 fee has been waived because of our relationship and partnership with Henry Schein. So I urge you on this call tonight. It is on a first come, first served basis. We're offering complimentary lease reviews, personalized lease review by myself, whereby, again, it's on a first come, first served basis. So if you are interested in the complimentary lease review, there will be a poll coming on the screen again very, very soon. Again, if you could just take a minute or two, if you are interested in that lease review, even if you don't have a lease, even if you're looking to start a practice, even if you own a building, again, it's a complimentary consultation. It will be tailored towards your specific standard, specific situation. And if you can just take a minute to fill in the exit poll, just some of the questions. If you joined the webinar late, gives me an idea of what your current situation, if you have a lease, if it's due to expire, if your situation is urgent. And if you are interested in that complimentary lease review and rent analysis, I strongly advise you. Some of the feedback, it's one of the best hours that people have got in the past. Now I know we're coming up towards time, and I did want to take some time for some questions. But one of the questions I think I just answered, it says, can you speak on the benefit of a lease review as a building owner? For sure, even if you are a building owner, and again, if you have a lease in place, if you don't, I definitely need to talk to you, because you need to have something set up between the building and the practice. So again, even if you don't have a lease, if you own a building, if you're looking to start a practice, not just specific, obviously the complimentary lease review, but it's a complimentary consultation. We find out a little bit more about you, do a little bit more deeper dive, and sure, definitely take advantage of it. If you do have any more questions or any questions, there are a few coming in I can see now. Please use the chat system. One question, I think we sort of touched on this before. What guarantees can you give that you're going to be able to make changes to a lease? My landlord, I've always had a difficult landlord. Now, again, it's just from our past experience. There's no guarantees, but what we can guarantee is with our approach, with our 25 years of intellectual property, and as you can see from some of the success that we've had, what we can guarantee is that if we go on to address a landlord with a proposal, most times it's music to the landlord's ears. And you know, the dental tenant, especially now, is becoming more of the anchor tenant, the healthcare tenant. If you look at some of the retail, nail salons and restaurants, they're all closing down, right? So you as a tenant, you do have leverage. Everything is negotiable. It's a choreographed game of chess or poker, depending on what game you prefer. But I do believe everything is negotiable for sure. So anyone, any more questions, please use the chat feature. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day, your evening to join tonight's webinar. I do appreciate you taking time. And then just any other questions? One question here talking about a month-to-month tenant. What I want to stress is that as a month-to-month tenant is something you never really want to be as a month-to-month tenant, because you are really leaving yourself exposed. You're saying to the landlord that I can give you 30 days notice and to leave, and vice versa, the landlord the same. So we never advise to be on a month-to-month basis. Also, you can pay additional rent if there's an overholding provision in the lease where the landlord will say, well, if you don't want to commit to any longer term, in some cases you can pay 150 to 200% additional on your rent. So I think that concludes the questions, and if everyone's filled in the exit poll, then I will say thank you again. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you found this beneficial. Please do take advantage of the complimentary lease review. It's on a first come, first served basis. So as soon as we receive that confirmation you're interested, I will follow up and send a copy of your existing lease, and we will go from there. So I wish you a nice evening. Stay safe, and thank you again. Thank you very much for joining. Have a good evening.